Okay, welcome. Yep, the pause, the power of the pause, the power of the pause. You'll see that advertised, the power of the pause, power of the pause. So take a pause, the three P's, pause, present, proceed. We've talked about that. Pause, present, bring yourself back to the present moment, and then proceed. Pause, present, proceed, the three P's, or the power of the pause. All right. Today, one of the things I wanted to talk about was something that you might hear in the news when you hear about mindfulness. If you read anything about mindfulness or anything like that, or any of the mechanisms of mindfulness, we've discussed some of the mechanisms in terms specifically with pain. And many years ago, we discussed about the default mode network, but it's time to bring that topic back. The We have discussed some of the uncoupling that occurs in the thalamus and the connectivity between the thalamus and the higher prefrontal cortex with people in pain. And the default mode network is a more general area of the brain, and this is often referred to even in like Time magazine or articles about mindfulness if you're looking up mechanisms. And also because I think it's important because we are practicing this modality, and it's good to know or actually have a sense of what may be actually happening to the brain, right? And with the introduction of functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, we can see live real-time changes in the brain as we're actually doing the practices. And so it's really neat to kind of, as you're doing a practice or as you're studying to do a practice or as you're even thinking about doing a practice, that you are familiar with some of the mechanisms that are occurring in the brain, specifically when you are doing a mindfulness or meditation practice. Okay. So I just have here again a couple of references that I want to refer to. And so first, what the default mode network is, and if you just kind of think about that name, the default mode, I think it's kind of a funny name because it's kind of a good name because if you kind of think about like, what's your default mode, right? Like, I'm reading have you guys seen the Wild Robot or read the book? Um, I'm reading it with my daughter, and it's a robot that actually sort of becomes kind of personified. But if you think about programming somebody, right? Let's say I come into your house and I say, I need to program you with a default mode. Like, what's the mode? What is the mode that you default to, right? What is that default mode? And so if you think about it, right, what is like even just asking, like, what is my default mode? How do I behave in my default mode? Anyways, this is called the default mode network. And it's a network, right? So any network is going to be a interconnection of multiple different areas. I always think of like the Verizon commercials, when they show the network of all the satellites or the network of all their connections, and then they compare it to another network and they say, we got better connections, right? So if you think of those sorts of maps, that map of the United States or of the world is probably the same thing as our brain. We all have these different areas of the brain, and they're all interconnected. And they're all interconnected differently. I mean, they're all connected, but they're all interconnected differently, depending on our entire life, how we were, what stimuli we had throughout our own life, what we've chosen to even pay more attention to, what we've chosen to train or not train. Anyway, so it's a network of interconnected brain regions, It becomes active when the brain is at rest or not focused on a specific task. So when your brain is at rest or not really focused on a specific task, it's most active during activities such as daydreaming. Right, so when you're daydreaming, your default mode network is like ding 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 ding. Okay, so what is your default mode when you're daydreaming? Recalling memories. What's your default mode when you're recalling memories? Thinking about the future. What's your default mode when you're thinking about the future? And contemplating one's own thoughts and emotions. That's a good one. I like that one. The default mode network is active when you are contemplating your own thoughts or emotions, right? That oftentimes is referred to like a self-referential, like you think of something and you're thinking about your own thinking and how your thinking is either good or bad, and you're referring and you're kind of, creating a reference of yourself based on your thinking and based on these emotions. So if you kind of, a lot of the ruminations, as we like to say in this, but contemplating your own thoughts and emotions, and then obviously in that contemplation, right, the self-judgment that arises from that contemplation. And so we all have a default mode network, and that's when it works. So it's most active during activities such as daydreaming, recalling memories, thinking about the future, or contemplating one's own thoughts and emotions. And if you think about how you feel when you're daydreaming, recalling memories, thinking about the future, or contemplating one's own thoughts and emotions, that's mostly then your default mode network at work. All right. There are specific areas of the brain, the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the angular gyrus and the lateral parietal cortex, and the hippocampus. Those are the four main key regions. There's more to that, but those are kind of the four main ones that really light up. And so sometimes when you see these maps, you see those four maps on the cross section of the brain, and you see them all connected. But I really like to think of it as like a web, like a complicated web. So if you think of it kind of like as a complicated web. So again, thinking about oneself or one's emotions, remembering the past or imagining the future, and storing and retrieving personal memories. These are all functions of the default mode network. So why am I bringing this up in terms of mindfulness? One of the cool parts about mindfulness is mindfulness practice. So you can imagine what this default mode network does, right? There was nothing in there about paying attention to the present. So the practice of mindfulness, actually, what it can do is it decreases the activity in your default mode network. And it can actually decrease the activity during the practice, and it can lead to decreased activity even after you're done with the practice as well. So if you kind of can imagine, right, with the mindfulness, as we're practicing mindfulness, we have this almost as if there's this buzz. I kind of call it like your default is on. You go into your practice, and that's kind of like, it's almost like the buzzing, the resting buzzing of the brain, bzzz, right? And that's like wiring us, right? Oh no, I got to do this. Oh my God, I thought I had that thought, so that's kind of the default mode that's happening. And so it's like that buzz, right? Right. And even though I'm resting, my mind is not quiet at all. There's nothing. And with the practice of mindfulness, paying attention on purpose to the present moment without judgment, we are quieting that default mode network. It's almost as if we're taking that like background buzz, the default mode, and going, let's try to quiet that default mode down. Let's try to shut that when there's like a high pitched screech background noise and something, you're like, yeah. That's kind of like what I imagine the default mode in my own brain. Might not be yours, but that's kind of how I imagine. And so we can turn the volume down. We don't, we're sort of turning it down. So mindfulness meditation helps reduce the activity of the default mode during rest. This decrease is associated with a reduction in mind wandering and self-referential thinking. So that self-referential thinking is that thinking about our thoughts and emotions and then judging them and then creating a reference of ourself based on those thoughts and emotions, right? So we're decreasing that, right? And how many times do you find that you get in trouble, not because of that first thought that comes up, but because of the self-referential and judgment thoughts that come afterwards? Those are the clincher ones. Those are the ones that pull us in, that grab us, that lead us to, not be able to pause, that lead us to be activated, lead us to, jump into things without having the pause and the presence to actually think about what we're doing. So there's a decrease, there's a quieting. There's kind of a quieting down of the default mode network with mindfulness. All right. What we've also seen is, we've seen this quieting, but then there are other things that might actually, associations or connections that might actually arise that might lead us to be able to respond to a situation as opposed to react to a situation. This is where most likely there's improved connectivity between the default mode network and executive controls. And what this means is that so with mindfulness meditation, you have stronger connections between the default mode network and networks that are involved in attention. Well, that's good because we are practicing paying attention, right? So if we're practicing paying attention, then we are activating those networks and self-regulation. All right. So what effect can this have? The effect that this can have is, with this increased connectivity between these executive functionings and the default mode network, we can have better management of intrusive thoughts. So as those thoughts come in that are self-referential, not only is the default mode network decreased, but the executive functioning, sort of the more logical aspect of the brain, can come in and decrease those intrusive thoughts, and almost kind of like reason, oh, that was just a thought coming in, and I can let it be. Okay. This is a good one, which I think this is kind of one of those things that also happens over time. And you may have noticed this with your own practice. It might not be immediate. This is one of those that might take some time, and this is when you know that sort of neuroplasticity is at work in your own brain. But there's an increased awareness of the present moment. And so because we're practicing present moment awareness in mindfulness, what happens is that when you're practicing mindfulness, because we're quieting the default mode network, we're quieting that default mode. So we're quieting that part of the brain that's defaulting, in essence, that goes into the ruminations, that goes into the thinking of the future or the past, that then we have less of the wandering mind throughout the day, because we're actively in our practice, we're actively in the present moment. Through the focus of our attention, the default mode network is quieting. And then when we're not practicing mindfulness, we've kind of like allowed the default mode network to silence a little bit, to be quiet, right? And this is not something that happens instantaneously. These are one of those practices that you might have noticed over time that, oh, I'm noticing I'm ruminating less, or I'm noticing that my mind is wandering less. I'm noticing that I'm focusing more on the present moment. I'm noticing that I'm focusing more on the sensations that I'm feeling in this moment as opposed to the ruminations or the wanderings of the past or the future. Okay. So this increased awareness of the present moment, it reduces habitual, right? These are habit, default, right? Where do we go with our default, our habit? When we sit down, we don't have anything to do. Boom, default mode network activates. Now you're like, oh, what did I do today? Oh, why did I say that I didn't like that guy, or my conversation with them, or I really screwed up and do this and all that stuff, right? That's all the default mode network being activated. It reduces habitual default mode network driven behaviors like ruminating on the past or worrying about the future. All right. So that's a really good, right? That's a really good activity. That's a really good exercise to try to strengthen, is being more in the present moment, decreasing ruminations about the past, worrying about the past or the future or anything like that. Mindfulness can affect the default mode network, and in doing so, mindfulness can help diminish emotionally charged thoughts, promoting emotional balance. And this is in regards to that self-referential aspect of the ruminating of thoughts, ruminating of memories, ruminating of emotions, and then the judging of those emotions or the judging of those thoughts, right? I'm anxious, so I shouldn't be anxious. I got my apartment. I'm anxious. And then what? And now I'm more stressed about my self-referential anxiety than I am about the anxiety of just allowing the anxiety to be. I hope that makes sense, because oftentimes that's like a trigger. It's like a coupled thought, that we have a thought that then leads to another thought almost instantaneously, that it's coupled, and it's like it's not the first thought that is really so distressing. It's actually it's like a domino effect. It's that thought which then leads to all these other thoughts, and all those other thoughts are mostly the judging, self-referential, how I see myself in this world of my emotions and thoughts. If we just see it as a thought and have no judgment of it, if I'm a good person, I'm a bad person, whether or not I have that thought, then it has no energy, right? Then you sort of see it as a thought that pops up, and it doesn't have any charge to affect my system. And with a quieted default mode network and an increased activation of my executive functioning, I can help regulate that and balance that, which is what mindfulness can help. Okay. And then a lot of research has shown, actually, structural changes over time. Long-term mindfulness practice, and this is a long-term, so there's short-term, decreased activity in the default mode network is short-term, that then can become long-term, but you can notice that immediately with practice. Improve connectivity between the default mode network and the executive controls, also immediately, but can grow with practice. But that's one of those things that can happen immediately. And then you have the increased awareness of the present moment, less ruminating on the past and worrying about the future, reduced emotional reactivity. And then with all these practices, right, as we do them, and we've talked about these, you can't see them, but you might be able to feel them. If we were to scan your brain pre and post practice, let's say 5 years of practice, we would see structural changes that occurred in your brain because of the practice itself. All right, so that's what they're confirming here, is long-term mindfulness practice has been associated with changes in brain structure, including reduced gray matter density in the default mode network regions, reflecting reduced overactivation. This is one of those areas that we would like to quiet down, and there's sort of a quieting of this system allows present moment to arise. It's sort of like, oh, I'm not so much ruminating about the past or the future. Right. And this is all from, the default mode network. So you might read in some magazines, or, if you're perusing something about the mechanisms of mindfulness, we've looked very closely at some of the mechanisms of mindfulness for pain. These are more general mechanisms of mindfulness in terms of looking at the default mode network. All this can help reduce anxiety and depression, can enhance your ability to focus and engage in goal-directed tasks, and provide greater emotional regulation and resilience. Okay. You may have noticed this, right? Even in some of your reflections, like, oh, I could have really flipped out on that person, or, I was really, I could have really gotten in a bad mood, but I decided, I would sort of took my breaths, or I paused, or, I did my breathing practice. I felt my, my thighs on the chair, my feet on the floor, and I brought myself back to the present moment. And there was a greater sense of focus. There was a greater sense of regulation. There was a greater sense, even if it's just a baby step forward, of regulating your emotions, of responding to something as opposed to reacting, and knowing that when you do react, you can really, we can all flip our lid, right? So, really noticing that this can have short-term and long-term effects on a very, we could say, hardcore neuroscience perspective. Very hardcore, right? Looking at real-time changes in these areas of the brain, the default mode network, when you're actually practicing mindfulness. And then long-term changes in actual structural integration, structural changes in the brain itself with these practices. Okay. So it's good to do these practices daily if you can. It's good to do these practices when you can do them, as much as you can think about it, as much as you can do it. And knowing that there's both an acute phase and a chronic phase. And when you do it more frequently, when you do have a daily practice, you're really getting into those long-term changes, and you're gonna really feel the changes over time that are more baseline. You're actually taking that default, right? Whatever the default buzz is, you're taking that and you're shifting it. Like, you're shifting your baseline. And that can happen. But that will take practice. You can notice it immediately, but with practice, you'll actually shift your baseline, and you'll start to notice it as, oh wow, I did that same activity that I usually always get really sweaty or anxious about, and it wasn't so bad. And those are those structural changes that they're talking about. Okay. So pretty cool, because whether you're in pain, or, doing mindfulness for pain management, or you're doing mindfulness to be more present, or you're doing mindfulness for whatever reason, it's really neat to kind of think about, not only are these practices, they've been done for millennia, but now we're really understanding the neuroscience behind it. Now we're really understanding how it's bringing about some of those emotional regulations and stress reduction changes in the brain, and how when we, especially that self-referential, when there's thoughts or emotions that arise that we use to create a reference of who we are, of who we think we are, and how that then creates the person we are, and how all those things are sort of almost automatically self-generated. It's like taking all the information and what you have and from the external world and creating a sense of self from that. Right? All that is happening in the default mode network, and recognizing that, wow, I'm doing this. You're doing this every single moment of every single day. And so that's why I go back to, what is your default? Right? When somebody comes to you and hands you something, what is your default? Right? And if I gave you a box of chocolates and you didn't know me, would you like, this box of chocolates got toxins in it? Is that your default? Whoa, right? Like that's probably a lot of people's defaults, right? And so, just more knowing yourself, right? And being like, okay, when I walk into a new situation or when I think about this, like, right. When I stop doing an activity, where does my mind go? What comes up? And that's your default. And then seeing that with time and practice, we can actually alter this. All right, so let's go into our practice. And in this practice, just sort of, I'll remind you, but just kind of bring in the fact that regardless of what mindfulness practice you're doing, whether we do a breathing practice, focusing on the sensation and body practice, whatever it might be, that in real time, we're affecting our default mode network. Okay, so let's find a comfortable posture. A posture you feel relaxed yet alert. Closing your eyes if you feel comfortable closing your eyes. If not, having a soft downward gaze as you're gazing off on the horizon. And taking 2 or 3 deep breaths. And really allowing yourself to be here now for this practice. Allowing yourself to be present. Giving yourself the permission that just for these next 10, 15 minutes, there's no place you need to be other than right here. There's nothing you need to do. There's no text message or email you need to check. Allowing yourself to be here. Allowing your body to be fully supported by the surface it's on. If you need more support, simply finding some pillows to support any body part that you need. Or you can lie down or sit. Really allowing the surface that you're on to hold your weight, to support you. Almost as if you're dropping down into the earth. And as we breathe regularly, bringing our attention to our resource, our anchor, any place that we can direct our attention to, that we feel safer. It might be the sensation of the breath as it comes in and out of our body. It might be a word or phrase or mantra. It might be a felt sense and emotion in our heart, our mind's eye, our feet, our thighs, our hands, our arms. It may be counting the breaths in, one, out, one. Whatever it is that you can direct your attention to that is an anchor, that is resourcing for you. And as your mind wanders, as soon as you notice your mind has wandered, that is a perfect moment of mindfulness. The mind wandering, the default mode network is active. With the practice of mindfulness, we come back to the present moment, come back to paying attention to something we choose consciously, on purpose, without judgment. As our mind wanders, the default mode network is active, and as we come back to the present moment, we quiet, soften the default mode network. In real time, decreasing neuronal activity in the default mode network. Decreasing those self-referential thoughts, the ruminations of the past or the future, worrying about the future, judging our past. Simply coming back to the present moment. There's nothing we need to do, just pay attention to our anchor or resource. And as we practice mindfulness, quieting the default mode network, you may even be able to visualize this in your mind's eye. Almost as if you could quiet your brain activity by simply paying attention to the present moment on purpose, without judgment. And just noticing where your mind is now. Coming back to your resource. Coming back to your anchor. Allowing that default mode network to quiet. And with that, taking 2 or 3 deep breaths. Opening your eyes if your eyes were closed. Stretching or moving if you need to stretch. And just taking a moment to reflect on your practice today.